When you think of Adam and Moses, you probably imagine an insurmountable abyss of time, thousands of years, dozens of generations lost in the mists of ancient history. Eden seems like a mythical memory, too distant to be accurately retrieved. The Exodus, though closer, still seems separated from creation by an impossible chronological chasm. But what if I told you that this perception is fundamentally wrong? What if pure mathematics, extracted directly from the genealogies of Genesis, revealed that the distance between the first man and the great lawgiver of Israel is frighteningly small? Today, you will embark on a mathematical journey through time that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the origins of humanity. We won't be talking about mythology or nebulous legends passed down through countless anonymous generations. We will be talking about names, dates, and numbers recorded with meticulous precision in the oldest text of Western civilization. We will be talking about overlapping lives that create an unbreakable chain of direct testimony, connecting the Garden of Eden to the plains of Moab, where Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. The thesis we present today is simple, yet revolutionary. Mathematically, only 5 or 6 people separate Moses from Adam, not hundreds of forgotten generations, but 5 eyewitnesses who could have sat in a circle and shared their stories. Adam could have told Methuselah about the creation of Eve. Methuselah could have told Shem about the voice of God in the garden. Shem could have told Abraham about the waters of the flood. Abraham could have instructed his descendants about the divine promise. And this unbreakable chain reached Moses, who did not write distant myths, but recorded the preserved memory of his own family lineage. This is not an exercise in blind faith. It is an exercise in forensic chronology. We will use Usher's chronology, refined by centuries of rabbinical and Christian study, cross-referencing it with the Masoretic text, the most reliable Hebrew version of the scriptures. We will examine each antediluvian patriarch, calculating not only when they were born and died, but with whom they lived. We will discover that the Bible does not offer us a fragmented history, but a cohesive record of direct oral transmission, where each generation physically touched the previous one. Prepare to see Genesis in a completely new way, not as an abstract religious text, but as what it truly is, an extended family diary, where centenarian great-grandparents shared with their grandchildren first-hand information about events they themselves witnessed or heard from direct eyewitnesses. The Word of God didn't travel through a cordless phone of thousands of generations. It traveled through 5 conversations, 5 embraces, 5 moments when an elderly man held a child's hand and said, "Let me tell you what I saw." When we finish this journey, you will never read Genesis the same way again. Creation will not seem distant, the flood will not seem legendary, and Moses will not seem like a scribe of ancient myths, but a meticulous historian recording the preserved memory of his own family, a memory that began with God's very breath upon the dust of the earth. This is the story of the golden chain that connects the first Adam to the liberator of Israel. This is the story of how truth survived time. To understand how information traveled from Adam to Moses with such precision, we first need to address the elephant in the room, the extraordinary longevity of the antediluvian patriarchs. 900 years. To the modern mind, this number seems impossible, mythical, even ridiculous. We live in an era where reaching 80 years of age is considered a blessing, where centenarians are celebrities. How can we take seriously the record of men who lived almost a millennium? But what if this longevity was not only biologically possible, but scientifically expected, given the unique conditions of the pre-flood world? What if the very structure of Genesis provided clues as to why these men lived so long, and why this capacity was dramatically reduced after the flood? The key lies in understanding 3 interconnected factors: original genetic purity, ideal environmental conditions, and the progressive genetic entropy that followed sin and the global cataclysm. When Adam was created, he did not possess an aged genome riddled with mutations accumulated over generations. He was, in the words of Genesis, created perfect, without defect. Modern molecular biology teaches us that aging is largely the result of the accumulation of errors in cell replication, the shortening of telomeres that protect our chromosomes, and mutations that accumulate throughout life. Adam did not begin with this burden. His DNA was literally the original template, the uncorrupted version of the human genetic code. Every cell division in his body copied perfect information. Every repair of molecular damage functioned with maximum efficiency. He was, biologically speaking, a machine designed to last. Eve, created directly from Adam, shared this genetic purity. Her children, though born after the fall, still carried the vast majority of this genomic integrity. Deleterious mutations take time to accumulate. A single generation could not significantly degrade such a robust genome. This is why we see Seth living 912 years, Enos 905, Canaan 910, Mahalalel 895, Jared 962, Enoch 365 before being translated, Methuselah 969, Lamech 777, and Noah 950 years. Observe the pattern. There is no significant decline before the flood. The antediluvian patriarchs consistently lived beyond 9 centuries. This is no coincidence. It reflects a biological reality. The human gene pool was still operating close to its original specifications. But there is more. The pre-flood environment was radically different from the post-flood world. Genesis mentions that God did not cause it to rain on the earth, but a mist rose from the ground and watered the entire surface. Many scholars suggest that this indicates a global greenhouse environment protected by a canopy of water vapor in the upper atmosphere. This layer would have blocked harmful cosmic radiation, created higher atmospheric pressure, increased oxygen levels, and provided protection against radiation-induced mutations that degrade DNA. Think about what this means for longevity. Less radiation equals less DNA damage. More oxygen equals more efficient cellular metabolism. Higher atmospheric pressure equals better circulation and healing. The pre-flood world was essentially a giant hyperbaric chamber, optimized for prolonged human life. Adam didn't just live longer because he was created perfect, but because the planet itself was calibrated to sustain that longevity. Now consider what this extreme longevity means for the transmission of information. Adam lived 930 years. Think about that. Almost a millennium of accumulated experience, of memories, of stories to tell. When you live 930 years, you don't just see your children grow up. You see your grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, and you continue to see generations multiply before your eyes. Adam could have personally known his descendants up to the 9th generation. He could have held Noah's great-great-grandfather in his lap. He could have shared meals with Lamech, Noah's father, and told him firsthand about the day God formed him from dust, about the moment Eve was created from his rib, about the conversation he had with the serpent, about the sound of God's footsteps in the garden at dusk. This is the biological reality that underpins the entire chain of transmission that we will explore. The patriarchs were not nebulous figures separated by vast gaps in time. They were contemporaries, living side by side for centuries, sharing stories, transmitting direct knowledge, creating an unbreakable network of eyewitness testimony that covered all of human history from creation to the Exodus. Longevity was not a mythological detail. It was the precise mechanism by which God ensured that his revelation would be preserved with perfect fidelity through the generations. Now let's do what few do. Grab a calculator and examine biblical chronology with mathematical precision. The first link in our chain of direct witness connects Adam, the first man, to Methuselah, the longest-lived man in recorded history. And what we discover when we do the calculations is not simply impressive, it's transformative. Adam was created in the year 0 of human chronology. He lived 930 years, dying in the year 930 of creation. Methuselah, in turn, was born in the year 687 of creation, when his father Enoch was 65 years old. Now, do the subtraction. If Adam died in the year 930 and Methuselah was born in the year 687, this means that Adam was still alive during 243 years of Methuselah's life, almost 2.5 centuries of direct overlap. Let this reality sink in. Methuselah didn't know Adam through stories told by his grandfather. He knew Adam personally. He heard Adam's voice. He saw Adam's face. For 243 years, the first man was already an elder of almost 700 years, while Methuselah grew from baby to adult and into a mature man. Imagine the conversations. Imagine the moments when young Methuselah, perhaps 10, 20, 50 years old, sat at the feet of the original patriarch and asked the questions we all would like to ask. What was Eden like? What was the world like before sin? What did God say when you tried to hide? What was it like to see the angel with the flaming sword guarding the way back to the garden? Adam was not merely a historical figure to Methuselah. He was a living relative, a distant but ever-present great-grandfather. And Adam had much to recount. 930 years of accumulated experience. He saw the world transform from a perfect garden into a planet marked by sin. He witnessed the first birth, the first baby's cry, the first time a human being other than himself and Eve breathed. He saw the first murder when Cain killed Abel. He lived with the guilt of knowing that his disobedience had introduced death into the world, and then he saw that death manifest itself for the first time in the life of his own son. But Adam also carried glorious memories. He remembered the fragrance of the trees of Eden, trees that no longer existed in the fallen world. He remembered the feeling of direct communion with God, of walking with the Creator without fear, without shame, without the barrier of sin. He remembered Eve before the fall, the perfect innocence that preceded the tragedy. He remembered the voice of God uttering the first human words, naming the animals, establishing the mandate to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And Methuselah absorbed all of this. For 243 years, he had direct access to the living archive of human history. He didn't need to rely on traditions passed down orally through intermediate generations. He heard it firsthand. And when Adam died in the year 930, Methuselah was 243 years old, still young by antediluvian standards, with 726 years still ahead of him to preserve and transmit this information. Consider the precision of this preservation. When we have direct access to an eyewitness, the margin for error is minimal. There is no room for distortion through intermediaries. There is no telephone game problem, where each person who relays a story adds or subtracts details. Methuselah heard it from Adam. End of story. And what Methuselah heard from Adam, he could transmit with absolute fidelity, because he himself was an eyewitness to Adam's testimony. But the story gets even more impressive. Methuselah lived 969 years, the absolute record for recorded human longevity. He was born in the year 687 and died in the year 1656, the exact year of the flood. The math is precise. 969 years after the year 687 leads us to the year 1656. Methuselah literally died in the year the floodgates of heaven opened and the fountains of the great deep gushed forth. Some scholars suggest he died in the week of the flood itself, perhaps days before Noah entered the ark. Others propose he died in the waters of the cataclysm. In any case, Methuselah served as the living bridge between the pre-flood world and the post-flood world, carrying in his memory almost a millennium of human history. And here is the crucial point. During his long life, Methuselah not only preserved Adam's memories, he transmitted those memories to the next critical witness in our chain, Shem, Noah's son, the man who would cross the flood and carry the knowledge of the ancient world into the new age. The first link is complete. Adam knew Methuselah. Methuselah guarded Adam's words, and Methuselah was about to pass this treasure on. The flood represents the greatest rupture in human history, a global cataclysm that destroyed all antediluvian civilization, wiped out entire continents, reshaped planetary geography, and reduced the human population to 8 people: Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their respective wives. All human memory, all the history accumulated since Adam, now depended on these 8 people preserving the knowledge of the world that had been destroyed. But what many fail to realize is that the transition from the antediluvian to the post-diluvian world was not a complete rupture. There was continuity, and that continuity has a name: Methuselah. Let's go back to the calculations. Shem was born in the year 1558 of creation, 98 years before the flood, which occurred in the year 1656. Methuselah, as we have already established, died in the year 1656, the very year of the flood. This means that Shem and Methuselah were contemporaries for 98 years, almost a century of direct overlap between the man who knew Adam and the man who would rebuild civilization after the flood. Think about what this means. Shem didn't learn about Adam through vague stories passed down through generations. He heard about Adam directly from Methuselah, who had heard it directly from Adam. The chain had only two links. Adam spoke to Methuselah. Methuselah spoke to Shem. Two conversations, two direct transfers of information, and for 98 years, Shem had ample opportunity to absorb everything Methuselah knew. Imagine the scene. Shem grows up in the antediluvian world, a world that still operated under the parameters of the original creation, albeit corrupted by sin. He sees around him evidence of extreme longevity. His great-grandfather Methuselah was still alive, a man who had been born only 600 years after Adam, and who carried personal memories of the first man. Shem could have asked Methuselah, "What did Adam tell you? How did he describe the garden? What were his exact words about God?" And Methuselah, with his memory spanning almost a millennium, could have answered with frightening accuracy. But Methuselah not only transmitted information about Adam, he was also an eyewitness to everything that had happened in the 9 centuries since Adam's death. He saw Cain's civilization develop, with its cities, its technology, its increasingly wicked culture. He saw the lineage of Seth remain faithful initially to God's calling. He personally knew all the patriarchs between Adam and Noah. He knew Seth, Enos, Canaan, Mahalalel, Jared, his own father Enoch before Enoch was translated, his son Lamech, and his grandson Noah. Methuselah was the living memory of the entire antediluvian era, and Shem absorbed this memory. For 98 years, he had access to a walking historical archive. He learned not only about creation, but about the entire trajectory of humanity from Eden to the threshold of the flood. He heard about the translation of Enoch, the only man besides Elijah who did not experience physical death. He heard about the growing evil that dominated the earth, about the Nephilim, about the violence that filled the world and led God to decide to send the flood. He learned all this not from distant legends, but from a man who had lived through every stage of this process. Then came the flood. The waters covered the earth. Everything Shem knew was destroyed. Every city, every house, every tree, every animal, every person who was not in the ark perished. And among the dead was Methuselah, the last direct link to Adam, the guardian of the memory of Eden. But Methuselah had fulfilled his mission. He had passed the baton to Shem. When Shem emerged from the ark on Mount Ararat and stepped into a completely renewed world, he carried with him the totality of the knowledge of the ancient world. He was now the guardian of revelation, the bridge between two eras, the man who knew how everything had begun and how it had been lost. And here's the crucial detail. Shem didn't die in the flood. He lived 500 years after the cataclysm, dying only in the year 2158 of creation. This means Shem had half a millennium to transmit the knowledge he had received from Methuselah, 500 years to tell and retell the stories of creation, the fall, the lineage of Seth, the translation of Enoch, the judgment of the flood. 500 years to ensure that the new humanity never forgot where it came from. The second link is complete. Methuselah met Shem. Methuselah transmitted to Shem everything that Adam had transmitted to him. And Shem, the survivor of the flood, was about to meet the next critical link in our chain. Abraham, the father of faith, the man with whom God would make an eternal covenant. The chain was not broken. Memory survived the cataclysm, and truth continued its journey through time. We have now arrived at the most shocking, most impossible to ignore, most transformative point of this entire chronological analysis. If you remember only one calculation from this journey, remember this. Shem, Noah's son who survived the flood, was alive when Abraham was born. Not only alive, but he lived for the first 150 years of Abraham's life. Let that sink in. The man who crossed the waters of the flood, who saw the antediluvian world destroyed, who personally knew Methuselah, who directly absorbed the testimony about Adam and Eden. This man knew Abraham. They were contemporaries. Let's look at the numbers. Shem was born in the year 1558 of creation, 2 years before the flood, according to Genesis 11:10, which records that Shem was 100 years old when he fathered Arphaxad, 2 years after the flood. The flood occurred in the year 1656. Shem lived 600 years, dying in the year 2158. Abraham was born in the year 2008 of creation. Do the math. Shem died in the year 2158. Abraham was born in the year 2008. This means that Shem lived until Abraham was 150 years old. 150 years of direct overlap between the survivor of the flood and the father of the Hebrew nation. This is not a peripheral detail of biblical chronology. This is the beating heart of how God's revelation was preserved. Abraham did not learn about the true God in a vacuum. He did not have a completely new revelation without any historical context. Abraham grew up in Ur of the Chaldeans, a city dominated by idolatry, where his own father Terah served other gods, as Joshua 24:2 confirms. But somewhere, somehow, Abraham knew the God of Noah, the God who had destroyed the world in the flood, but spared a righteous family. Where did this knowledge come from? The most logical, most direct, most mathematically probable answer is Shem. Abraham could have known Shem personally. He could have talked to Shem. He could have heard from Shem firsthand about the day the floodgates of heaven opened, about the terror of the rising waters, about the months confined in the ark, about the moment the ark rested on Ararat, about the rainbow and God's promise never again to destroy the earth with water. Abraham could have asked Shem about Methuselah, and Shem could have answered, "Yes, I knew Methuselah for 98 years, and he told me about Adam, about the garden, about the creation of Eve, about the serpent and the fall." Consider the richness of this direct transmission. Abraham wasn't operating with distant mythology. He had access to first-hand testimony about events that had occurred only a few hundred years before his birth. To put that in perspective, the time gap between the flood in 1656 and Abraham's birth in 2008 is 352 years. That's less time than the distance between us today and the French Revolution. Imagine if you could talk to someone who was at the French Revolution. Imagine the accuracy of the information you could obtain. Now multiply that by the longevity of Shem, who not only lived through the flood, but lived 600 years and was there, alive and available, when Abraham was forming his understanding of who God was. Some scholars have suggested that Shem may be identified with Melchizedek, the mysterious priest of the Most High God, who blessed Abraham in Genesis 14. The logic is fascinating. Melchizedek appears without a recorded genealogy, which would be strange in a text so obsessed with genealogies unless his identity was obvious to the original readers. Melchizedek is described as king of Salem, likely the future Jerusalem, and priest of the Most High God, serving the true God in an age dominated by idolatry. Who else could fill this role besides Shem, the last living remnant of the antediluvian world, the guardian of true worship, the man who knew God in a way that no one else did? Although this identification is speculative, what is not speculative is the cold mathematics. Shem and Abraham were contemporaries, and this contemporaneity solves one of the greatest puzzles of the biblical narrative. How did Abraham, growing up in a pagan culture, come to know the one true God? The simplest answer is that he heard it from someone who knew, and the most obvious someone is Shem, the man who not only survived God's judgment, but who carried in his memory the entire history of humanity since creation. When God called Abraham in Genesis 12, saying, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you," Abraham obeyed. He left Ur. He left the safety of civilization. He became a nomad, living in tents, waiting for a city whose architect and builder is God, as Hebrews 11 describes. But this radical obedience did not arise from nothing. It was built on the foundation of knowledge. Abraham knew who God was because someone had told him, and that someone, mathematically, could easily have been Shem, the last living link to the world that God had judged and renewed. When Shem finally died in the year 2158, Abraham was 150 years old and had already received the divine promise of becoming a great nation. The baton had been passed. Shem had fulfilled his monumental mission to preserve the knowledge of the true God through the cataclysm of the flood and to transmit it to the generation that would become God's chosen people. The third link is complete. Adam knew Methuselah. Methuselah knew Shem. Shem knew Abraham. 3 handshakes, 3 direct transfers of testimony. and the truth continued its unstoppable march through the generations. The current now moves through the patriarchs we all know from family narratives: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But what we often don't appreciate is how long these men's lives were and how this created extraordinary generational overlaps. Information wasn't being passed through dozens of intermediaries. It was being passed directly from father to son, from grandfather to grandson, in face-to-face conversations that lasted decades, sometimes centuries. Abraham lived 175 years, dying in the year 2183 of creation. His son Isaac, born when Abraham was 100 years old, lived 180 years, dying in the year 2288. This means that Isaac and Abraham lived together for 75 years after Isaac's birth. But here is the detail that broadens our perspective. Isaac was born in the year 2108, which means he was still alive during the last 50 years of Shem's life. Isaac, the son of the promise, the miracle born to Sarah in her old age, met Shem, the survivor of the flood. Think of the conversations that could have taken place. Shem, over 500 years old, sharing with young Isaac about the world that had been destroyed, about the ark, about Methuselah, about the stories Methuselah had told about Adam. Isaac, in turn, had a son named Jacob, born when Isaac was 60 years old, in the year 2168 of creation. Jacob lived 147 years, dying in the year 2315 in Egypt. Do the math of the overlap. Jacob was born in the year 2168, and Abraham died in the year 2183. This means that Jacob and Abraham were contemporaries for 15 years. Jacob personally knew his grandfather Abraham. He heard directly from Abraham about God's call to leave Ur, about the promise of the land, about the miraculous birth of Isaac, about the ultimate test on Mount Moriah when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. Jacob did not learn these stories second-hand or third-hand. He heard them from the patriarch himself. But it gets even more impressive. Jacob had 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel. One of these sons was Levi, born in the year 2245 of creation. Levi lived 137 years, dying in the year 2382. Now trace the overlap. Levi was born while Isaac was still alive. Isaac died in the year 2288. Levi was born in the year 2245. Levi lived with his grandfather Isaac for 43 years. Levi heard from Isaac firsthand. Levi also lived with his father Jacob for 70 years, absorbing the entire family narrative, the entire story of God's promise, all the memory preserved since Adam. Now we come to the crucial figure bridging the gap between the patriarchs and Moses. Amram, also called Amram, son of Kohath, son of Levi. Amram was born during the period of slavery in Egypt. He married Jochebed, and together they had 3 children, Miriam, Aaron, and Moses. Amram lived 137 years, the same number of years as his grandfather Levi. Although the exact dates are more difficult to calculate during the Egyptian period, due to the suppression of chronology during slavery, we know for sure that Amram was only the 3rd generation from Levi. Levi entered Egypt with Jacob. Kohath was Levi's son. Amram was Kohath's son. Moses was Amram's son. Consider the compression of that lineage. From the point when Jacob and his family went down to Egypt to the point when Moses liberated Israel, 430 years passed, as Exodus 12:40 records. But during those 430 years, there were only 4 generations: Levi, Kohath, Amram, Moses. How is this possible? Only through the continuous longevity that characterized the generations immediately after the flood. Lifespans were still long enough to create massive overlaps. Amram, Moses' father, grew up hearing the stories of his grandfather Levi, and Levi had heard them directly from Jacob, who had heard them directly from Isaac, who had heard them directly from Abraham, who had heard them directly from Shem, who had heard them directly from Methuselah, who had heard them directly from Adam. When Amram shared these stories with his son Moses, he wasn't transmitting vague mythology. He was transmitting family memory, preserved through just 6 people: Adam, Methuselah, Shem, Abraham, Isaac or Jacob, Levi, Amram, Moses. This is the genealogy of truth. This is the unbreakable chain of testimony. And that is why, when Moses writes the book of Genesis, he is not inventing. He is not stitching together conflicting myths from various cultures. He is recording the history of his own family, a history that has been preserved with meticulous fidelity because each generation had direct access to the previous generation. Knowledge did not travel through 100 anonymous intermediaries. It traveled through 6 conversations, 6 moments when an elderly man held the hand of his son or grandson and said, "Let me tell you what my father told me, what his father told him," which goes back to Adam himself in the garden. Moses is traditionally recognized as the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Modern critical scholars often challenge this authorship, proposing that these texts were compiled centuries later by multiple anonymous authors who stitched together conflicting oral traditions. But when we examine the mathematical chronology we have established, the entire premise of modern textual criticism collapses. Moses didn't need multiple conflicting sources. He had something far better: direct family memory preserved through just a few generations of extremely long-lived eyewitnesses. Moses was born approximately in the year 2433 of creation, during the period of slavery in Egypt. He was educated in Pharaoh's court, receiving the best education available in the ancient world, including reading, writing, and encyclopedic knowledge of Egyptian culture. Acts 7:22 tells us that Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in words and deeds. He was, in other words, perfectly qualified for the task of writing the definitive history of his people, but Moses' academic qualifications are secondary compared to his genealogical qualifications. Moses was a Levite, a direct descendant of Levi, one of Jacob's 12 sons. This means that Moses grew up immersed in the traditions of his tribe, the tribe that would be set apart for priestly service, the tribe charged with preserving and transmitting God's law. His own father, Amram, was a guardian of these traditions. And Amram had learned from Kohath, who had learned from Levi, who had personally known Isaac and Jacob. Consider the precision of this transmission. When Moses writes in Genesis 1, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," he is not speculating about nebulous events lost in the mists of mythical time. He is recording information that traveled through a documentable chain. God revealed to Adam how creation occurred. Adam told Methuselah, Methuselah told Shem, Shem told Abraham, Abraham told Isaac, Isaac told Jacob, Jacob told Levi, Levi told Kohath, Kohath told Amram, Amram told Moses. 9 transfers, 9 conversations. Each one mathematically verifiable through the chronological overlaps we have established. When Moses describes the Garden of Eden in Genesis 2, with its 4 rivers, its specific trees, its geographical layout, he is recording descriptions that Adam gave firsthand. Adam saw the garden, Adam walked there, Adam named the animals there, and Adam told Methuselah exactly what it was like, with the kind of detail that only an eyewitness can provide. This description passed intact through the stream until it reached Moses, who recorded it with the precision of a professionally trained scribe. When Moses describes the flood in Genesis 6-9, he is recording the testimony of Noah and his sons. Shem was there. Shem saw the waters rise. Shem experienced the months confined in the ark. Shem stepped into a completely renewed world. And Shem told Abraham, who told Isaac, who told Jacob, who told Levi, who told their descendants, until finally Amram told Moses. The account of the flood in Genesis is not recycled Mesopotamian mythology. It is the preserved testimony of a survivor, transmitted through an unbreakable chain to the final scribe. When Moses records the interactions between God and Abraham, the trials of Isaac, the deception of Jacob, the journey to Egypt, he is recording recent family history. Only 4 generations separated Moses from Jacob. His own great-grandfather Levi had known Jacob personally. These were not ancient legends. They were family memories, the kind of stories grandparents tell their grandchildren, preserved with the kind of fidelity that only exists within close-knit family units. And here is the beauty of Genesis' structure. It is organized into toledot, a Hebrew word meaning generations or accounts. 10 times in Genesis we see the phrase, "These are the generations of," followed by a name. The generations of heaven and earth, the generations of Adam, the generations of Noah, the generations of Shem, the generations of Terah, the the generations of Isaac, the generations of Jacob. Many scholars believe these markings indicate specific written or oral sources that Moses compiled under divine inspiration. In other words, Moses may have had access to family records, perhaps even tablets or documents that had been preserved through the generations. He wasn't creating from scratch. He was editing, organizing, and canonizing historical materials that his own family had preserved. When Moses finally wrote the Pentateuch, likely during the 40 years of wandering in the desert after the Exodus, he was 80 years old or more. He had led Israel out of Egypt. He had received the law on Mount Sinai. He had mediated between God and the people for decades, and now, under divine inspiration, he recorded the complete history from creation to his own era, creating the literary foundation upon which all subsequent scripture would be built. Genesis is not a document of mysterious authorship created centuries after the events. It is the preserved testimony of a family, recorded by an exceptionally skilled scribe, who had direct access to the memory transmitted through only 6 intermediaries since the first man. This is the answer to the question of how the truth survived. God, in his providence, structured human longevity in such a way that generations dramatically overlapped, creating a network of eyewitness testimony that covered all of history from Eden to the Exodus. Moses did not need to guess. He only needed to hear, remember, and write. Now we must address an obvious question. If the antediluvian patriarchs lived 900 years, and if this longevity was critical for the accurate transmission of information, why did human longevity drop so dramatically after the flood? Why did Shem, although he lived 500 years after the flood, not live 900 like his antediluvian ancestors? Why did Abraham live only 175 years? Why did Moses live only 120? What happened to human biology that reduced our life expectancy from almost a millennium to about a century in just a few generations? The answer lies in a concept that modern genetics calls genetic entropy, the progressive accumulation of deleterious mutations in the human genome over generations. Each time DNA is copied during reproduction, small errors occur. The vast majority of these mutations are neutral or slightly harmful, not drastically affecting immediate function. But over many generations, these mutations accumulate, compromising the efficiency of cellular processes, increasing susceptibility to disease, and critically reducing life expectancy. Before the flood, the human gene pool was still relatively close to Adam's original perfection. Although sin had introduced death into the world, and although mutations were beginning to accumulate, the process was slow. Additionally, as we discussed earlier, pre-flood environmental conditions, likely including a protective vapor canopy in the atmosphere, less cosmic radiation, and higher atmospheric pressure, protected human DNA from external damage. The result was consistent longevity in the 900-year range. The flood changed everything. The cataclysm not only destroyed civilization, but radically reshaped the planetary environment. The vapor canopy, if it existed, collapsed, sending 40 days and nights of torrential rain. The fountains of the Great Deep burst forth, suggesting massive tectonic activity. The post-flood world was a different planet, more cosmic radiation reaching the surface, harsher weather, changes in diet as God permitted the consumption of meat for the first time, and an overall environment more hostile to prolonged human life. But there is another factor, often overlooked: the population bottleneck. After the flood, all of humanity descended from just 8 people: Noah, his wife, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and their wives. In genetic terms, this is an extreme bottleneck. The entire human gene pool was reduced to the diversity contained in these 8 people. And when populations experience bottlenecks, deleterious mutations that were present but diluted in the larger pool become fixed and amplified in subsequent generations. There is no larger gene pool to dilute the effects of these mutations. They spread, accumulate, and begin to exert real phenotypic effects, including reduced longevity. Observe the pattern after the flood. Shem lived 600 years, a reduction of 300 years compared to the antediluvian patriarchs. His son Arphaxad lived 438 years. Shelah, son of Arphaxad, lived 433 years. Eber lived 464 years. Peleg, born during the division of languages at Babel, lived only 239 years, a dramatic drop. Reu lived 239 years. Serug lived 230 years. Nahor lived 148 years. Terah, Abraham's father, lived 205 years. Abraham lived 175 years. The decline is consistent and dramatic. In less than 10 generations after the flood, human life expectancy fell from 600 years to less than 200. This is not a random change. It is a clear pattern of progressive genetic degradation. Each generation accumulated more mutations. Each generation experienced more DNA damage. Each generation lived less. God himself commented on this change. In Genesis 6:3 before the flood, God said, "My spirit will not contend with man forever, for he is mortal. His days will be 120 years. Traditionally, this is interpreted as God giving antediluvian humanity 120 years of warning before the flood. But some scholars suggest that this also represents a divine decree limiting future human life expectancy. And indeed, after several post-flood generations, human life expectancy stabilized around 120 years, exactly as God had declared. Moses died at 120 years old, and although Deuteronomy 34:7 records that his eyes were not dim nor his natural force abated, his age became the normative ceiling for human longevity. Genetic entropy explains why we can no longer live 900 years. Our DNA has accumulated thousands of generations of mutations since the flood. Our telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes, shorten more rapidly. Our DNA repair mechanisms are less efficient. Our environment is more hostile. Biologically speaking, we are much further from the original perfection of Adam than the antediluvian patriarchs were. But there is a providential beauty in this. God allowed longevity to remain high enough for long enough to ensure that his revelation was accurately preserved. By the time longevity began to decline dramatically, the stream of witness had already been established. Adam had spoken to Methuselah. Methuselah had spoken to Shem. Shem had spoken to Abraham. The truth had crossed the flood and been delivered to the patriarchs of Israel. And by the time Moses wrote Genesis, the revelation was complete and recorded in permanent written form, no longer dependent on oral testimony, but preserved in text for all future generations. Genetic entropy does not invalidate the biblical record. It confirms it. The decline in human longevity is exactly what we would expect if Genesis were historically accurate. And the fact that this longevity remained high during the critical period of transmission reveals the providential hand of God orchestrating human biology to serve his redemptive purposes. We now return to our original question. Did Adam know Moses? The literal answer is no. Adam died more than 1,000 years before Moses was born. They never breathed the same air, never walked the same earth, never exchanged a word. But mathematically, genealogically, through the providential chain of testimony that God established, the distance between them is not an insurmountable abyss. It is a bridge of only 5 handshakes. Adam held Methuselah's hand and said, "Let me tell you about the day God formed me from the dust." Methuselah held Shem's hand and said, "Let me tell you what Adam told me about the garden." Shem held Abraham's hand and said, "Let me tell you about the world God destroyed and renewed." Abraham held Isaac's hand. Isaac held Jacob's hand. Jacob held Levi's hand. And through that Levitical lineage, the truth reached Amram. And Amram held Moses' hand and said, "Let me tell you the story of our family, a story that goes back to the very breath of God." 5 handshakes, 5 conversations, 5 transfers of direct eyewitness testimony. This is not mythology. This is not a game of telephone through anonymous generations. This is history preserved with meticulous fidelity because God in his infinite wisdom structured human biology and human chronology to ensure that his revelation would not be lost, would not be corrupted, would not be forgotten. When you open your Bible and read Genesis, you are not reading ancient speculation about origins. You are reading the preserved testimony of eyewitnesses. You are reading what Adam told Methuselah, what Methuselah told Shem, what Shem told Abraham, what Abraham passed down through his lineage to Moses, who, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, recorded everything with the precision of a scribe trained in the palaces of Egypt. This calculation transforms everything. It transforms how we read about creation, knowing that the description came directly from Adam. It transforms how we read about the fall, knowing that Adam recounted his conversation with the serpent, the moment he ate the forbidden fruit, the terror of hearing God's footsteps in the garden. It transforms how we read about the flood, knowing that Noah and his sons recounted the terror of the waters, the months in the ark, the rainbow of divine promise. It transforms how we read about Abraham, knowing that he could have sat at Shem's feet and heard about the antediluvian world firsthand. The truth that time has not erased is not an abstract truth, it is a personal truth passed down from father to son, from grandfather to grandson, preserved through the providential longevity that God granted precisely for this purpose. And when that longevity finally began to diminish through genetic entropy, the work was done. The revelation was complete. The scriptures were written. The word of God was preserved forever. Today, thousands of years after Moses, we have the privilege of holding these same scriptures. The Genesis we read is the Genesis that Moses wrote, based on the testimony that Amram gave him, based on the testimony that Levi preserved, based on the testimony that Jacob received, based on the testimony that Abraham absorbed, based on the testimony that Shem shared, based on the testimony that Methuselah kept, based on the testimony that Adam gave. The chain was not broken. The truth was not lost. God was faithful. And this faithfulness calls us to a response. If God was so meticulous in preserving his revelation through the generations, if he orchestrated biology and chronology to ensure that the truth reached us intact, then this truth demands our total attention, our total trust, our total obedience. Genesis is not an optional document for those interested in ancient religion. It is the preserved testimony about who we are, where we came from, why the world is broken, and how God planned to fix everything through the promise made first to Adam, then to Noah, then to Abraham, a promise that was finally fulfilled in Jesus Christ, the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. Adam did not know Moses personally, but through the providential chain of witness that God established, Adam spoke to Moses. And through the scriptures that Moses wrote, Adam speaks to us today. The voice of the first man still echoes through the millennia, preserved by God's faithfulness, transmitted through only 5 generations of faithful witnesses, recorded forever in God's inerrant word. This is the truth that time has not erased. This is the truth by which we live.